The gavel echoed through the heavy mahogany-paneled walls of Manhattan's Family Court, Part 44. But the loudest sound in the room was a woman's absolute unnerving silence. Clara sat at the petitioner's table, 8 months pregnant, her face a masterclass in porcelain indifference. Across the aisle, her soon-to-be ex-husband smirked, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit, utterly convinced he had legally stripped her of every dime they had ever acquired. He had the high-priced shark of a defense attorney. He had the labyrinth of offshore accounts. He even had his young mistress watching eagerly from the gallery. But Richard had absolutely no idea that in less than 10 minutes, the presiding judge was about to read a stack of financial documents that would completely, irreversibly dismantle his entire existence. The air conditioning in the courtroom hummed a low, monotonous drone that did little to cut the stifling tension. Judge Harrison Caldwell, a man whose 30 years on the bench had carved deep, permanent grooves of skepticism into his forehead, peered over his reading glasses. He looked down at the 2 tables before him, a tableau of a violently dying marriage. At the defense table sat Richard Sterling. At 38, Richard was the picture of modern corporate success. He was the founder and CEO of Aegis Systems, a logistics software firm that had recently been valued at just north of $60 million. He possessed the kind of manufactured charm that worked wonders in Silicon Valley boardrooms and Manhattan gala dinners. Today, he wore a navy Tom Ford suit, his posture practically radiating triumph. Beside him was Gregory Pierce, a notoriously aggressive divorce attorney known in legal circles as the Wealth Saver, a man who specialized in ensuring that the wives of ultra-rich men walked away with pennies on the dollar. At the petitioner's table sat Clara. She wore a simple, structured charcoal maternity dress, her hands resting lightly on the massive swell of her stomach. She had not spoken a single word since she entered the courtroom, not to the bailiff, not to the judge, not even to her own attorney, an unassuming, soft-spoken older man named Arthur Mitchell. For the past 2 hours, Clara had simply stared straight ahead, her eyes fixed on a spot on the wood paneling just behind the judge's head. She was a statue, a ghost haunting her own divorce proceedings. "Mr. Pierce," Judge Caldwell's voice was gravelly, carrying the weight of the room. "You may continue your direct examination of your client." Gregory Pierce stood, buttoning his suit jacket with a theatrical flair. "Thank you, Your Honor." He paced slowly toward the witness stand where Richard sat, looking perfectly relaxed. "Mr. Sterling, before the recess, we were discussing the early years of Aegis Systems. Can you clarify for the court exactly what role your wife Clara played in the founding and daily operations of this multi-million-dollar enterprise?" Richard chuckled, a low, patronizing sound that grated against the heavy silence of the room. "Clara's role? Well, she picked out the coffee machine for the break room once. I believe it was a Keurig. Aside from that, her primary role was spending the capital I brought home. While I was pulling 80-hour weeks, sleeping under my desk, and securing our Series A funding, Clara was busy managing her Pilates schedule and coordinating our interior decorator." "Objection," Arthur Mitchell said mildly, not even standing up. "Relevance, Your Honor. The petitioner's fitness routine has no bearing on the equitable distribution of marital assets." "Man, sustained," Judge Caldwell grumbled. "Keep it to the financials, Mr. Boris. Pierce, the court does not need a dramatic reading of the Sterling household's domestic grievances." "Apologies, Your Honor," Pierce said smoothly. "The point we are establishing is one of contribution. The defense asserts that Mr. Sterling is the sole architect of the marital wealth. Clara Sterling contributed 0 financial capital, 0 intellectual property, and 0 sweat equity to Aegis Systems. Therefore, under the terms of the post-nuptial agreement signed 22 months ago, she is entitled only to the standard spousal support outlined in Document 4A, and no equity in the company whatsoever." In the gallery, sitting in the second row, a young woman in a designer trench coat crossed her legs and smiled. This was Chloe Davenport, Richard's 24-year-old director of public relations, and the woman whose text messages Clara had discovered 6 months ago. Chloe was brazenly wearing a pair of diamond drop earrings that Clara immediately recognized. They were a Christmas gift Richard had bought for Clara 3 years ago. Clara had not shed a tear when she found them missing from her jewelry box, just as she did not shed a tear now. She just took a slow, deep breath, feeling a sharp kick against her ribs from the baby, and maintained her absolute silence. "Mr. Sterling," Pierce continued, holding up a thick manila folder, "let's talk about the real estate portfolio. The penthouse in Tribeca, the ski lodge in Aspen, the estate in the Hamptons. How were these purchased?" "The Maud, through my holding company, Horizon Ventures," Richard answered confidently. "I set up Horizon to manage my personal investments outside of Aegis Systems. The capital used to purchase those properties came directly from my own restricted stock units and bonuses. Clara's name is not on the deeds. They belong to Horizon Ventures, of which I am the sole managing director. And the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands? Corporate tax strategies legally managed under the Horizon umbrella," Richard replied smoothly. Pierce turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the paper trail is irrefutable. Richard Sterling built the wealth, protected the wealth, and holds the legal titles to the wealth. We respectfully submit that the petitioner is attempting to use her current delicate condition," Pierce gestured vaguely toward Clara's pregnant belly, "to garner unearned sympathy from this court and claim assets she has absolutely no legal right to touch." Richard leaned back in the witness chair, looking directly at Clara. For a brief second, his polished mask slipped, revealing a look of pure, venomous spite. He was punishing her. He was punishing her for daring to file for divorce, for refusing to look the other way regarding his affairs, for threatening the pristine, perfect image he projected to the world. He was going to leave the mother of his unborn child with a modest apartment and a monthly stipend that he could control like a dog on a leash. Judge Caldwell made a final note on his legal pad, his expression unreadable. He looked over at the petitioner's table. "Mr. Mitchell, your witness for cross-examination." The courtroom held its collective breath. This was the moment. The high-powered defense had laid out a brutal, suffocating case. They had painted a picture of a brilliant, hard-working titan of industry shackled to a superficial leech. They had introduced binders of financial structures, LLC operating agreements, and the ironclad post-nuptial agreement Richard had bullied Clara into signing under the guise of estate planning almost 2 years prior. Arthur Mitchell, Clara's attorney, was an enigma. He was an older man with thinning gray hair, a slightly rumpled suit, and a demeanor that bordered on lethargic. Throughout the entire morning session, he had barely taken a note. He hadn't objected to Richard's most inflammatory statements. He seemed utterly outmatched by the sleek, aggressive Gregory Pierce. Mitchell stood up slowly, pushing his chair back. He adjusted his glasses, looked at Richard on the stand, then looked at his own client. Clara didn't nod. She didn't blink. She simply continued her silent vigil. "The petitioner has no questions for this witness, Your Honor," Mitchell said quietly. A collective gasp rippled through the small gallery. Even Judge Caldwell's eyebrows shot up toward his receding hairline. "Excuse me, Mr. Mitchell," Judge Caldwell asked, leaning forward. "Did you say no questions? Your client is facing a proposed settlement that strips her of nearly 95% of the marital estate, and you are declining to cross-examine the respondent." "That is correct, Your Honor," Mitchell said, his voice polite and completely devoid of panic. "We find no need to question Mr. Sterling on his testimony. We believe his statements regarding his belief in his ownership of these assets are entirely sincere." Richard let out a sharp, incredulous laugh from the witness stand. He looked at his lawyer, Pierce, who gave him a subtle, victorious nod. It was over. Clara's lawyer was throwing in the towel. They had intimidated him, outmaneuvered him, and legally drowned him. Richard felt a rush of euphoria so intense it was practically intoxicating. He looked at Clara, expecting to finally see her break, expecting to see the tears, the panic, the realization that she had lost everything. But Clara just sat there. The morning sunlight caught the edge of her profile, illuminating a face that was remarkably serene. "Very well," Judge Caldwell said slowly, clearly baffled by the petitioner's lack of defense. He struck his gavel lightly. "The witness may step down. Mr. Mitchell, does the petitioner have any witnesses to call? Does Mrs. Sterling wish to take the stand?" "No, Your Honor." "Mrs. Sterling will not be testifying," Mitchell replied. He picked up a single, heavily reinforced black binder from the floor beside his briefcase. It was thick, easily 400 pages. However, the petitioner would like to submit Exhibit 104 into evidence. Copies were delivered to the defense counsel and your clerk precisely at 11:59 p.m. last night, meeting the midnight discovery deadline. Gregory Pierce shot to his feet. "Your Honor, I object. We received a massive digital file dump late last night. We have not had adequate time to review these documents. This is a blatant ambush tactic. You received them before the deadline, Mr. Pierce," Judge Caldwell noted dryly. "Whether you chose to stay up and read them or sleep is not the court's concern. The court, however, has had its clerks reviewing them since 6 o'clock this morning." The judge motioned to his bailiff, who retrieved the heavy black binder from Mitchell and handed it up to the bench. Mr. Mitchell," Judge Caldwell said, looking at the ominous binder. "Perhaps you could summarize the nature of this late submission for the court." "Certainly, Your Honor," Mitchell said, stepping out from behind his table for the first time. "Mr. Sterling and his counsel have spent the morning detailing the vast wealth held by Aegis Systems and the parent holding company, Horizon Ventures. They have accurately described the real estate, the offshore accounts, and the corporate structure. They have repeatedly stated that Mr. Sterling is the sole proprietor and managing director of these entities. We haven't just stated it, we've proven it," Pierce interrupted aggressively. "Mr. Pierce, let him finish," the judge barked. Mitchell didn't miss a beat. "As I was saying, they have accurately described the existence and value of these assets. Where they are mistaken, however, is in their understanding of who actually owns them." Richard's triumphant smirk froze. In the gallery, Chloe Davenport stopped playing with Clara's diamond earrings and leaned forward. "What is he talking about?" Richard hissed to his lawyer. Pierce just shook his head. His eyes narrowed at Mitchell. "Your Honor," Mitchell continued, his voice finally projecting across the room. 5 years ago, Mr. Sterling was facing a massive corporate liability lawsuit from a former business partner. To shield his assets from potential seizure, he created Horizon Ventures. He needed a proxy, someone whose name was not legally tied to his ongoing litigation, someone he believed was thoroughly controllable and entirely ignorant of corporate finance. Mitchell turned to look at Clara. For the first time all day, Clara turned her head. She looked directly at Richard, and the absolute deadness in her eyes was suddenly replaced by something terrifyingly sharp. "He put the holding company in my client's maiden name," Mitchell said. "Clara Bennett. He had her sign a mountain of documents telling her it was routine tax paperwork for their future children." "This is absurd," Richard shouted from his table, slamming his hand down. "I am the managing director. I have the voting shares. I built that company. Mr. Sterling, you will remain silent or I will hold you in contempt." Judge Caldwell roared, banging his gavel. The courtroom fell instantly silent. The judge turned a piercing gaze back to Arthur Mitchell. "Counselor, proceed. Carefully." The silence in the room was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of Clara's defeat. It was the taut, crackling silence of a bomb with a lit fuse. "Your Honor," Mitchell said, opening his own copy of the black binder, "if you turn to page 14, you will find the original articles of incorporation for Horizon Ventures, filed in the state of Delaware. You will note the sole listed proprietor is Clara Bennett. Mr. Sterling appointed himself as managing director, yes. He held operational control, but he did not own the entity. Lol, cove. Are it transferred? Boom. Judge Caldwell flicked to the page, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. He frowned, pulling his reading glasses further down his nose. I see the incorporation documents, Mr. Mitchell, but managing directors have fiduciary power. Mr. Sterling could have restructured the company at any time. He could have, Your Honor, Mitchell agreed. And he intended to, when he forced my client to sign the post-nuptial agreement 22 months ago. Clause 4B explicitly stated that Clara Sterling surrendered all rights to any entities managed by Richard Sterling. He believed the clause legally transferred ownership of Horizon Ventures back to him. Because it did, Gregory Pierce practically yelled, jumping to his feet. Your Honor, the post-nup is ironclad. He signed away her rights to Horizon Ventures. This is a desperate, pathetic smokescreen. Mitchell smiled. It was a small, sad smile. Mr. Pierce is correct. The post-nup would have transferred ownership. If, at the time of the signing, Clara Sterling still owned Horizon Ventures, Richard's face drained of color. He looked from his lawyer to Mitchell, his breathing suddenly shallow. What did you do? He whispered, though the microphone on his table picked it up, broadcasting his panic to the entire room. If you will turn to page 47, Your Honor, Mitchell instructed calmly, you will see a legal transfer of assets. Exactly 3 years ago, a full 14 months before the post-nuptial agreement was ever drafted, my client legally transferred total ownership of Horizon Ventures, and by extension, all of its subsidiary assets, real estate, and offshore holdings. Transferred to whom? Judge Caldwell asked, his voice laced with genuine astonishment. To an irrevocable blind trust, Your Honor. The Aegis Legacy Trust, registered in South Dakota. The judge rapidly flipped the pages. The rustling of paper sounded like a hurricane in the quiet room. And who is the sole beneficiary of this irrevocable trust, Mr. Revocable? Mitchell. The unborn child currently residing in my client's womb, Your Honor, and until the child reaches the age of 25, the sole legal trustee with absolute, unchecked executive power over the trust and all its holdings is Clara Sterling. Gregory Pierce snatched a document from his paralegal, his eyes darting frantically over the text. This is impossible. A transfer of that magnitude would require the signature of the managing director. Richard never signed this. Actually, he did, Mitchell countered smoothly. Page 62, a general power of attorney signed by Richard Sterling 5 years ago, granting Clara Sterling the right to sign financial documents on his behalf in the event of his absence. He was on a 3-week yoga retreat in Bali with his executive assistant at the time. My client utilized that legally binding document to countersign the transfer. Judge Caldwell stared at the paperwork. He looked at the signature. He looked at the state seals. He looked at the South Dakota trust laws cited in the margins. The judge had seen thousands of divorces. He had seen hidden bank accounts, burned down houses, and every dirty trick in the book. But he had never, in his entire career on the bench, seen a legally perfect, entirely invisible financial decapitation executed with such flawless precision. The judge slowly took off his glasses. He looked at Richard Sterling. The tech CEO was gripping the edge of his table, his knuckles bone white, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Mr. Pierce, Judge Caldwell said, his voice dropping an octave, are you telling me your firm did not conduct a deep-level audit of the holding company's master ownership before drafting a post-nuptial agreement? Pierce was sweating profusely. Your Honor, my client assured us he was the sole owner. The K1 forms were filed under the trust's tax ID, which Mr. Sterling's own automated accounting software processed blindly for the last 3 years. Mitchell interjected. He never checked the underlying paperwork because he assumed his wife lacked the intellect to understand it. He built an empire on a plot of land he didn't own, Your Honor. And he just spent the last 2 hours of this court's time bragging about exactly how much money is sitting in accounts that belong entirely to a trust controlled by his wife. Not no. Ooh. Clara finally moved. She slowly reached into her purse, pulled out a small crystal bottle of water, and took a delicate sip. She paced the bottle down, folded her hands back over her pregnant belly, and looked directly into Richard's panicked, horrified eyes. She still hadn't said a word. She didn't have to. Judge Caldwell leaned into his microphone. Let me be absolutely clear so the court reporter gets this on the record. Mr. Mitchell, you are stating, with documented proof, that the $12 million penthouse, the $5 million Aspen Lodge, the Cayman offshore accounts, and the controlling shares of Aegis Systems belong entirely to the Aegis Legacy Trust, Your Honor. Yes, meaning Mr., but the Martwinge. Sterling. The judge looked at the arrogant man who had strutted into his courtroom that morning. Owns essentially nothing. Not entirely nothing, Your Honor, Mitchell corrected gently. As detailed on page 212, Mr. Sterling is still the sole owner of the 2014 Honda Civic he purchased before the marriage, and roughly $42,000 in personal credit card debt. In the gallery, Chloe Davenport abruptly stood up. She stared at Richard, her face pale, her eyes wide with the realization that she was currently wearing earrings that likely belonged to a South Dakota trust fund, and she was sleeping with a man whose net worth had just plummeted from $60 million to negative $42,000 in the span of 3 minutes. Without a word, Chloe turned on her designer heel and practically sprinted out of the courtroom, the heavy wooden doors slamming shut behind her. Richard didn't even watch her leave. He was staring at Clara. You, Richard choked out, his voice a ragged whisper. You set me up. Clara's lips curved upward. It was the faintest, most terrifying smile Richard had ever seen. The silence in the room had finally been broken, shattered by the weight of a woman who had spent 5 years quietly, methodically, and legally building an inescapable trap. And the judge hadn't even reached the section regarding Richard's personal bank accounts yet. The heavy silence in the courtroom was broken only by the frantic, rhythmic tapping of the court reporter's fingers. Judge Caldwell slowly turned the page of the massive black binder. The hostility that had previously radiated from Richard Sterling's table had evaporated, replaced by the distinct metallic scent of sheer panic. Gregory Pierce, Richard's high-priced wealth-saver attorney, was frantically scrolling through his tablet. His face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. Your Honor, this is an ambush of the highest order. A power of attorney document from 5 years ago cannot be used to secretly restructure an entire corporate empire. We will file for an immediate injunction. We will sue for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and you will lose, Mr. Pierce, Arthur Mitchell interrupted, his voice still maintaining that infuriatingly calm conversational tone. The laws governing irrevocable blind trusts in South Dakota are exceptionally clear. The transfer was legal, notarized, and filed with the state. The statute of limitations to contest the transfer expired exactly 24 months ago, which, ironically, is precisely when your client forced my client to sign the post-nuptial agreement. Richard gripped the mahogany table so hard his fingernails dug into the polished wood. Fine, he spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and desperation. Fine, you stole the real estate. You stole the offshore cash. But I am still the founder and CEO of Aegis Systems. I built the code. I own the patents. My base salary is $3 million a year, plus stock options. You can take the houses, Clara, but you can't take my company. Oh, I told true. Clara did not blink. She merely shifted slightly in her chair, placing a protective hand over her pregnant stomach, and looked at Arthur Mitchell. Mitchell let out a heavy sigh, the kind the disappointed teacher gives a slow student. Your Honor, if I may direct the court's attention to Section 4 of the binder. Specifically, page 312. Judge Caldwell's eyes darted to the page. He adjusted his glasses, his brow furrowing so deeply it looked like a permanent scar. This is a corporate resolution from the Aegis Systems Board of Directors. That is impossible, Richard shouted, completely abandoning protocol. The board meets quarterly. Our next meeting isn't until November, and I control 82% of the voting share. You controlled 82% of the voting shares, Mr. Sterling, Mitchell corrected. Past tense, those shares were held by Horizon Ventures. And as we have just established, Horizon Ventures is wholly owned by the Aegis Legacy Trust. Therefore, the voting power of those shares belongs exclusively to the sole trustee. Mitchell gestured an open hand toward Clara. My client. Pierce looked like he was about to be physically ill. Your Honor, let him finish, Mr. Pierce, Judge Caldwell commanded, his eyes glued to the document. The judge was visibly fascinated by the sheer scale of the legal slaughter taking place in his courtroom. As the trustee holding an 82% supermajority, Mitchell continued, my client has the unilateral authority to call an emergency unannounced shareholder meeting. She did so yesterday afternoon at 2 p.m. in my office. During this meeting, acting as the majority shareholder, Mrs. Becould, Sterling voted to immediately dissolve the current board of directors. Richard's mouth fell open. A low, strangled noise escaped his throat. Following the dissolution, Mitchell said, relentlessly turning the pages of his own binder, Mrs. Resista. Sterling appointed a new 3-person board. The board consists of myself, my senior partner, and Mrs. Sterling, with an immediately held a board vote regarding executive leadership. No, Richard whispered. It was the sound of a man watching a train bear down on him while his feet were stuck in the tracks. No, you can't. Page 314, Your Honor, Mitchell said. At 2:45 p.m. yesterday, the newly appointed Board of Aegis Systems voted unanimously to terminate Richard Sterling as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. The courtroom erupted, not with noise but with an atmospheric shift so violent it felt like the air pressure had dropped. The bailiff stepped forward, his hand resting cautiously on his utility belt, anticipating that Richard might physically lunge across the aisle. Furthermore, Mitchell raised his voice just enough to cut through Richard's rapid, hyperventilating breaths. Mr. Sterling is not entitled to his golden parachute or his severance package. As detailed on page 320, the board found Mr. Sterling in gross violation of the company's morality and fiduciary clauses. What fiduciary clauses? Pierce demanded, trying desperately to salvage anything for his client. He made the company wildly profitable. He also used corporate funds to maintain a luxury apartment in Soho for his public relations director, Miss Met. Chloe Davenport, Mitchell stated flatly. He expensed over $400,000 in private jet travel, jewelry, and consulting fees to Ms. Davenport over the last 2 years. Embezzlement of corporate funds for the purpose of maintaining an extramarital affair is a direct violation of his employment contract. He is terminated with extreme prejudice. He leaves with nothing. Judge Caldwell stared at the paperwork, then slowly raised his eyes to look at Richard. The tech titan, the genius CEO, the man who had strutted into the room treating his pregnant wife like a discarded piece of luggage, was currently slumped in his chair. His expensive Tom Ford suit suddenly looked 3 sizes too big. He looked hollowed out. Mr. Sterling, Judge Caldwell said, his voice stripped of all judicial neutrality, leaving only a profound, cold awe. It appears your employment has been terminated. And since you previously testified under oath today that you have no personal savings outside of the holding company, he has his checking account, Pierce interrupted weakly, his personal checking account at Chase Bank. Ah, yes, Mitchell smiled politely. The checking account. Page 4011, Your Honor. Mr. Sterling's personal checking account is currently overdrawn by $700. It seems his auto-pay for his leased Ferrari hit at midnight just after his corporate salary direct deposit was legally frozen by the new board. Richard buried his face in his hands. A dry, racking sob tore out of him. It was a pathetic, broken sound. Clara watched him cry. Her expression did not change. There was no pity, no gloating, no joy. She simply watched the man who had tried to destroy her shatter into a million pieces. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Caldwell said, leaning back in his tall leather chair and folding his hands. The judge looked exhausted, as if he had just run a mental marathon. "I have been on the bench for 32 years. I have presided over the divorces of billionaires, senators, and royalty. I've never seen a legal execution as thorough, as merciless, and as flawlessly documented as this." "Thank you, Your Honor. I have an exceptional team," Mitchell replied modestly. "But I have a question," the judge continued, ignoring the lawyer's humility. "This level of financial architecture, it requires intimate knowledge of corporate law, tax codes, and Mr. Sterling's exact daily movements. It requires someone to have orchestrated a slow, invisible, multi-year campaign of asset reallocation right under the nose of a man who claims to be a genius. The judge turned his piercing gaze away from the lawyers. He looked directly at the pregnant woman sitting perfectly still at the petitioner's table. "Mrs. Sterling," Judge Caldwell said softly. The entire courtroom froze. The scratching of the court reporter's machine stopped. Even Richard lifted his head from his hands, his bloodshot eyes locking onto his wife. Throughout the entire morning, Clara had been treated as an object in the room, a problem to be solved, a nuisance to be dismissed. "Mrs. Sterling," the judge repeated, "I am directing this question to you. Did you build this?" For a long, agonizing moment, Clara said nothing. She looked down at her hands, which were resting gently on the curve of her stomach. Then she slowly raised her head. She looked at Richard, then at his lawyer, and finally she met the judge's eyes. When she spoke, her voice was not weak or trembling or emotional. It was clear, resonant, and cold as liquid nitrogen. "Yes, Your Honor. I built it." Richard flinched as if he had been struck. It was the first time she had spoken in his presence in over 3 months. "How?" Richard rasped, his voice tearing. "You don't know anything about finance. You dropped out of your master's program to plan our wedding. You spent your days at charity luncheons." Clara turned her head slowly, fixing her gaze on the man she had married. "I didn't drop out, Richard. I deferred. And my master's program wasn't in art history, as you so often like to tell your friends at dinner parties because it sounded softer. It was in forensic accounting." A sharp intake of breath echoed from Gregory Pierce's side of the room. A forensic accountant, Richard handed the keys to his financial empire to a woman trained specifically to track hidden money. "When we met," Clara continued, her voice echoing perfectly in the silent room, "you were struggling. Aegis was barely a concept. I edited your business plans. I balanced your personal ledgers so you could afford to eat while you coded. But the moment the Series A funding hit, I became an accessory. You told me my job was to look beautiful and maintain our social standing. You told me not to worry my pretty little head about the money." She paused, taking a slow breath. "I listened. I played the part. I hosted the dinners. I wore the dresses. And then, 4 years ago, I found the first burner phone." Richard's face drained of the last remaining drop of color. "It was an assistant named Jessica back then," Clara said to the judge, though her eyes never left Richard. "I didn't confront him. I knew what would happen. He had all the money, all the power, and he had already drafted a preliminary postnup that would leave me with nothing if I filed for divorce. If I left him then, I would have been destroyed." Clara reached out and lightly tapped the massive black binder sitting on Mitchell's table. "So I didn't leave," she said quietly. "I stayed, and I went to work. When the liability lawsuit hit him 5 years ago, he panicked. He was terrified of losing his money. He rushed the creation of Horizon Ventures. He brought me the incorporation papers at breakfast, told me it was a tax loophole, and told me to sign on the bottom line. He didn't even read page 14, where the holding company was listed under my maiden name. He was too busy texting Jessica. You planned this for 5 years? Richard whispered, the absolute horror dawning on him. The sheer sociopathic patience required to sleep next to a man, smile at him, and quietly dismantle his life piece by piece for half a decade was beyond his comprehension. No, Richard, Clara corrected sharply. I secured myself 5 years ago. I only weaponized it when I got pregnant. She looked down at her stomach, a flicker of genuine fierce emotion finally crossing her porcelain features. When I found out about Chloe, I realized the cycle was never going to end. But this time, it wasn't just my life you were playing games with. You were going to do to our child exactly what you did to me. You were going to use your wealth to control us, to threaten us, and to keep us begging for scraps while you lived however you pleased. Clara looked back at Judge Caldwell. I didn't steal anything, Your Honor. Every dollar in that trust was earned during our marriage. Every share of Aegis was built while I managed his life so he could work. When he forced me to sign the postnuptial agreement 2 years ago, he sat in this very courthouse and laughed, telling me that the law is written by men who want to keep what they conquer. She leaned forward, the icy mask returning. I simply read the laws better than he did. I used his own arrogance, his own power of attorney, and his own utter disregard for the documents he signed to ensure that my child will never ever have to ask Richard Sterling for a dime. The courtroom was dead silent. Even Arthur Mitchell, who had orchestrated the legal filings, looked at his client with a mixture of deep respect and slight terror. Judge Caldwell slowly closed the black binder. The heavy thud sounded like a coffin lid snapping shut. Mr. Pierce, the judge said, his eyes glued to the closed binder. Does the defense have any rebuttal? The silence that followed Judge Harrison Caldwell's question was heavy, absolute, and suffocating. Does the defense have any rebuttal? The judge repeated, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. Gregory Pierce, the million-dollar wealth-saver attorney, looked as though he had just been physically struck. His normally sharp, aggressive posture had completely collapsed. He stared at his tablet, swiping uselessly through the digital copies of the binder, frantically searching for a loophole, a typo, a misfiled date, anything to stop the bleeding. Your Honor, Pierce stammered, his voice lacking entirely the booming confidence it had possessed just an hour ago. The defense requests a brief recess. We need to review these documents with our client in private to determine the veracity of these claims. Denied. Judge Caldwell snapped immediately, not even looking up from his notes. You had the documents before the midnight deadline, Mr. Pierce. The fact that you and your client chose to sleep instead of doing your due diligence is not the court's problem. You have spent the entire morning attempting to legally suffocate a pregnant woman. I am not granting you a recess so you can figure out how to unstep on a landmine. Richard Sterling abruptly stood up, his chair scraping violently against the polished floor. His face was a patchwork of stark white fear and boiling red rage. This is fraud, Richard bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at Clara. She's a thief. You can't let her do this. I am Aegis Systems. I wrote the foundational code. I own the patents. Even if she stole the company's shell, she doesn't own my intellectual property. I will strip the code from the servers, I'll take the patents to a competitor, and I will burn Aegis to the ground before I let her take it. Arthur Mitchell didn't even stand up this time. He simply sighed, adjusted his glasses, and turned to page 512 in his binder. Actually, Mr. Sterling, Mitchell said, his voice cutting through Richard's hysterics like a scalpel, you don't own the patents. If you recall, 3 years ago your accountants advised you that holding the patents personally was creating a massive income tax liability on your royalties. To shield that income, you executed a total intellectual property assignment, transferring every single patent, copyright, and line of proprietary source code you ever wrote directly to Horizon Ventures. Richard froze. His hand, still pointing at Clara, slowly began to lower. Your own signature is on the transfer, Richard. Clara said, speaking to him directly for the second time that day. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. I remember the evening perfectly. We were at the Aspen Lodge. You signed it on the kitchen island while drinking a glass of Macallan, bragging to me about how brilliant you were for outsmarting the IRS. You handed over your life's work to the holding company to save 6% on your taxes. And, Mitchell interjected politely, since the Aegis Legacy Trust wholly owns Horizon Ventures, the trust owns the patents. If you attempt to access the code, copy it, or take it to a competitor, the board of directors, which you no longer sit on, will immediately press federal charges for corporate espionage and intellectual property theft. Richard looked like he couldn't breathe. He gripped his chest, his eyes darting wildly around the room as the walls of his own arrogance closed in on him. He turned to his lawyer, Greg. Do something. File an injunction. Freeze the assets. Gregory Pierce slowly stood up. He did not look at Richard. He looked directly at Judge Caldwell. Your Honor, Pierce said, his voice tight and formal. At this time, I would like to file an immediate motion to withdraw as counsel for the respondent. Richard whipped his head around, his jaw dropping. What? What are you doing? What? Pierce finally turned to his client, and the look of sheer, unadulterated disgust on the lawyer's face was devastating. I was retained to represent a high-net-worth individual in an equitable distribution case, Mr. Madde. Sterling. My firm requires a mandatory $500,000 retainer to proceed to trial. You paid the initial $100,000 with the remainder auto-drafting today at noon. Pierce checked his gold Rolex. It is currently 1:15. Given that your corporate salary has been frozen, your offshore accounts belong to a trust, and your personal checking account is overdrawn by $700, that payment has undoubtedly bounced. Furthermore, my firm will not suborn fraud, and you blatantly lied to us about your ownership of these assets. I didn't lie, Richard pleaded, the anger suddenly vanishing, replaced by naked, pathetic panic. I didn't know. Greg, you can't leave me here. We have a contract. Our contract has a clause regarding financial insolvency and client misrepresentation, Pierce said coldly, snapping his briefcase shut. He looked back at the judge. Your Honor, I formally request to withdraw. Judge Caldwell looked at the scene with grim satisfaction. Under the circumstances, Mr. Pierce, the court grants your motion. You are dismissed. Pierce didn't say another word. He didn't shake Richard's hand. He simply picked up his Italian leather briefcase, nodded respectfully to Arthur Mitchell and Clara, and walked out of the courtroom, his polished shoes clicking loudly against the marble floor. Richard Sterling was left standing entirely alone at the defense table. The high-powered legal team he had hired to destroy his wife was gone. The mistress he had flaunted was gone. The company he had built was gone. Clara, Richard whispered, his voice cracking. The arrogance had been entirely burned away, leaving only a hollow, terrified shell of a man. He took a step toward her table. Clara, please. It's me. It's Richie. We can fix this. You don't have to do this. Think about the baby. Think about our family. Bailiff. Judge Caldwell barked sharply. The armed bailiff immediately stepped between the two tables, placing a firm hand on Richard's chest, pushing him back. Step back to your table, Mr. Sterling. Clara looked at the man she had loved, the man she had supported, the man who had repeatedly, callously betrayed her and then tried to leave her destitute. I am thinking about our family, Richard, Clara said softly, her eyes entirely devoid of warmth. That is exactly why I did this. You are a financial cancer. You extract, you consume, and you destroy. I simply excised the tumor before it could spread to my child. Mitchell cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention back to the legal proceedings. Your Honor, there is one final matter regarding the dissolution of the marital estate. Proceed, Mr. Mitchell, Judge Caldwell said, leaning forward, though I cannot fathom what else there is left to take from him. It is not a matter of taking, Your Honor. Mitchell corrected gently. "It is a matter of liability. As we established, Mr. Sterling was terminated by Aegis Systems for gross violation of fiduciary duties, specifically the embezzlement of over $400,000 in corporate funds used to finance his extramarital affair with his public relations director." Richard slumped into his chair, burying his face in his hands. "The new board of directors," Mitchell continued, "has formally filed a civil suit against Mr. Muther, Sterling, for the restitution of those funds. Because he acted outside the scope of his employment to commit fraud, the company's limited liability protections do not apply to him. He is personally responsible for the debt." Judge Caldwell raised an eyebrow. "And since his personal accounts are empty?" "Correct, Your Honor." Mitchell nodded. "Mr. Sterling is walking out of this courtroom today not merely penniless, but nearly $500,000 in debt to a company he no longer controls, owned by a trust he cannot touch. Furthermore, the board is legally obligated to report his fraudulent K-1 tax filings to the IRS. He will likely be facing a severe audit and potentially federal tax evasion charges." Richard didn't scream this time. He didn't argue. He just sat there, staring blankly at the wood grain of the table, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The total, comprehensive annihilation of his life was complete. Judge Harrison Caldwell spent the next several minutes in absolute silence, carefully reviewing the summary documents provided by Arthur Mitchell. The only sounds in the room were the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional pathetic sniffle from the defense table. Finally, the judge closed the binder, capped his fountain pen, and folded his hands atop the high mahogany bench. He looked down at the ruined man before him. "Richard Sterling," Judge Caldwell began, his voice carrying the full, unyielding weight of the judicial system. "In my 3 decades on this bench, I have seen every breed of greed, malice, and narcissism that human beings are capable of inflicting upon one another. I have seen spouses hide money in the walls of houses. I have seen them burn down businesses rather than split the profits. But I have rarely encountered a man so blindingly arrogant, so convinced of his own untouchable superiority, that he orchestrated his own total destruction and didn't even notice until the trap snapped shut." Richard didn't look up. He remained slumped forward, staring at his empty hands. "You came into this courtroom today intending to weaponize the law to leave your pregnant wife with nothing," the judge continued, his tone laced with heavy disgust. "You treated her as an accessory, a fool, and an obstacle. Instead, the court finds that Mrs. P. Sterling has legally, ethically, and brilliantly outmaneuvered you at every conceivable turn." The judge picked up his gavel. "Having reviewed the documentation, the court finds the Aegis Legacy Trust to be a legally binding, irrevocable entity under the laws of South Dakota. The court recognizes the transfer of Horizon Ventures and all its subsidiary assets to said trust. The court further recognizes the legal dissolution of your employment and board seat at Aegis Systems." Judge Caldwell looked over at the petitioner's table. "Mrs. Sterling, as the trustee, your control over these assets is absolute and uncontested. The post-nuptial agreement presented by the respondent is hereby rendered entirely moot, as the respondent possesses no assets to protect." Clara gave a small, respectful nod to the bench. "Regarding the divorce decree," Judge Caldwell said, shifting a document toward his clerk, "I am granting an absolute divorce on the grounds of cruel and inhuman treatment, supplemented by documented adultery. Mrs. Sterling is granted sole physical and legal custody of the unborn child." Richard flinched at the word solo, but he didn't protest. He had no lawyer, no money, and no standing. As for child support, the judge paused, a grim smile touching his lips. "Given that the child is the sole beneficiary of a trust worth north of $60 million, and the respondent is currently unemployed, deeply in debt, and facing federal tax scrutiny, I find that the respondent has no meaningful financial contribution to offer." Judge Caldwell leaned closer to the microphone. "However, the law requires a calculation. Mr. Bousand, Rond Fischned Sterling, You will be ordered to pay the state minimum of $150 a month in child support. If you secure employment, perhaps flipping burgers, assuming you can pass a background check with your pending IRS audit, that money will be garnished directly from your minimum wage paycheck. The humiliation was absolute. The tech titan, the genius CEO, was being ordered to pay poverty-level child support that would be forcefully extracted from whatever menial labor he could manage to find. Finally, Judge Caldwell said, his eyes narrowing, "Mr. Sterling, you testified under oath today that your primary residence is the Tribeca penthouse, and you drive a leased Ferrari." "Yes," Richard croaked, his voice barely audible. "Mr. Mitchell," the judge asked, "what is the status of those properties?" "The Ferrari was leased under the corporate name, Your Honor," Mitchell replied pleasantly. "The new board reported it as a stolen corporate asset at 10 a.m. this morning. The police are currently waiting in the courthouse parking garage to impound it." Richard's head snapped up, pure terror in his eyes. "And the penthouse?" the judge asked. "Owned by the holding company. The board terminated Mr. Sterling's right to occupy the premises. The building management changed the locks at 9 a.m. His personal belongings, the ones not purchased with corporate funds, have been boxed up and left with the doorman." "Very well," Judge Caldwell said. "Mr. Sterling, you have no car, no home, no company, and no wife. This court is adjourned." Bang! The crack of the gavel echoed like a gunshot. The bailiff immediately moved toward Richard. "Sir, I need you to hand over your corporate security badge and the keys to the vehicle. Now." Numbly, his hands shaking violently, Richard reached into his pocket and placed the heavy red Ferrari key fob and his Edge's keycard onto the wooden table. He looked up at Clara. She was standing up, letting Arthur Mitchell help her into her sleek charcoal maternity coat. She looked radiant, powerful, and entirely untouched by the wreckage around her. She picked up her designer handbag purchased with her own forensic accounting salary years ago and turned to walk down the aisle. "Clara," Richard called out, his voice breaking into a pathetic sob. "Where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do?" "Not Surratt." Clara stopped at the heavy wooden double doors of the courtroom. She turned her head, looking back over her shoulder at the man who had tried to break her. The fluorescent lights caught the edge of her perfectly maintained composure. "I don't know, Richard," Clara said, her voice echoing one final time in the grand paneled room. "But I suggest you don't worry your pretty little head about it." She pushed the doors open and walked out into the bright Manhattan afternoon, leaving the doors to slam shut on Richard Sterling's old life forever. If this ultimate story of absolute patience, brilliant legal maneuvering, and deeply satisfying courtroom revenge kept you on the edge of your seat, you are not alone. Clara's methodical 5-year plan to legally outsmart a narcissistic billionaire proves that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one who says nothing at all. Don't let arrogance blind you to the quiet strength of those you underestimate. Did Richard get exactly what he deserved, or was Clara's trap too cold-blooded? We want to hear your thoughts on this unbelievable corporate takedown. If you loved this dramatic unraveling of an empire, hit that like button. Share this jaw-dropping story with anyone who loves a flawless plot twist. And make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life storytelling and courtroom dramas. See you in the next video. You wish.